Imagine a world where your favorite meat products are produced without the need for traditional livestock farming. It's a game changer for our planet and our palates. Coming up on this episode.
I realized at that time that I wanted to be part of the solution.
Chicken livestock has expanded to the point that there are now approximately 3 chickens for every human on the planet.
We as humans have cleared a significant portion of arable land on the planet in order to plant lots of crops, to feed animals, to feed us. And there is an opportunity with cell-based meat to rewild some of those spaces and have less of an impact with how we are growing our food for ourselves.
Upside Foods, formerly known as Memphis Meats, is a pioneering food tech company headquartered in the heart of innovation in Berkeley, California. Since its inception in 2015 by visionaries Uma Valetti, Nicholas Genovese, and Will Clem, Upside Foods has been on a mission to revolutionize the way we think about and produce meat. This company is not just thinking outside the box, they're redefining it. Using cutting-edge biotechnology, they're growing sustainable cultured meat. In this episode, Danielle Desmet joins us to share her insights into the incredible work happening at Upside Foods. With a background rooted in science and innovation and a passion for sustainable food production, Danielle is at the forefront of the company's groundbreaking projects. Without further ado, let's welcome Danielle Desmet to the Future Here show. Hi, Danielle. Welcome to Future Here. Really glad to have you on the show. Could you please first introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Danielle Desmet. I am the Chief of Staff to the Chief Science Officer at Upside Foods, and I've been with the company for more than 7 years. I was the first full-time employee, and it's been quite a ride, and I'm really excited to tell you guys about cultivated meat and where we've been and where we're going.
Excellent. Sounds really interesting. Can you first tell us a bit about your background and how you became interested in science and tech?
Yeah, so I'll go way back. As a kid, I was always interested in the oceans and forests. I fell in love with nature at an early age and have always been interested in ways that we can protect the planet. So fast forward to college, I did my undergrad at UC Berkeley in molecular environmental biology, and that's where I really started to gain an awareness about how biotechnology is a path to solving some of our biggest environmental challenges. And at that time, I also took an urban agriculture class, which really definitely opened my eyes to what we are doing to the planet just by feeding ourselves. And so through going to grad school, I realized at that time that I wanted to be part of the solution instead of studying in detail how humans are kind of destroying the planet.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah. Can you remember any specific stories of what in science and tech then pulled you towards you in terms of an early age?
For the science part, it was really ecology and understanding how ecosystems work. They're just such fascinating relationships that, trees have made with fungi and bugs have made with different plants, and animals have made with different insects. Like, this web of connections is such a fascinating piece of evolution that, is amazing. And it's actually what supports our lives. I mean, forests and oceans, they clean things for us. They regulate the climate. They provide clean water. These are all like fundamental to how humans live on the planet.
What then personally interests you about food-related science and tech?
The sustainability aspect is what really gets my attention. So we as humans have cleared a significant portion of arable land on the planet in order to plant lots of crops, to feed animals, to feed us. And there is an opportunity with cell-based meat to rewild some of those spaces and, have less of an impact with how we are growing our food for ourselves.
And why cultivated meat then specifically?
Meat production is such a massive impact on the planet. So conventionally produced meat is responsible for about 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. It takes about a third of arable land and fresh water. And that's across all of the operations and agricultural requirements needed just to produce meat. And we're also slaughtering like 70 billion animals a year, which is just a huge number every year. So those impacts combined on top of the fact that the global population is projected to be 9 billion by 2050, which means meat demand is expected to double because the growth sectors of where that population growth is coming from is primarily in China and India. And as people gain more money, they typically go towards eating more animal protein, and the planet just doesn't have the resource to support that demand. So that's one of the reasons cultivated meat is a tool in the toolbox for expanding the food supply. And it's why it's so interesting to me, because we need to live on this planet and also eat.
The human condition right there. So could you take us through what cultivated meat or lab-grown meat specifically is then?
I'll tell you a little bit about how it works. Let's start there. So we take cells from a fertilized chicken egg or live animal biopsy or an animal that's part of the existing food supply chain and then isolate the desired cell types that we want to grow. And so we take those cells and we put them into our cell line development process. And that is basically looking for the cells that are best suited to the cultivated meat process that we've designed. We also do cell culture media development. We also call that cell feed. And in the cell feed is made up of everything that the cells need to grow and divide. So all the raw materials that you would typically find in blood are in the cell feed. So fats, sugars, salts, vitamins, things like that. And the cell feed is tuned to the specific requirements of that cell. And so once we found the cell and the media combination we like, then we start creating a cell bank. And the cell bank is exactly what it sounds like. It's a repository of frozen cells that we can withdraw from for the manufacturing process. So the cell bank is composed of thousands of 1 milliliter vials. They're very small. Of these cells, that those are the starting material for the production process. And so when the production process is ready to start, we thaw the cell bank into a cultivation system, and we grow that culture into larger and larger and larger volumes because the cells are dividing and dividing and dividing. We're making more of them. And then once the cells are large enough, we then harvest them. They're growing inside of what we call a cultivator, which is a large stainless steel tank, also known as a bioreactor in the biopharmaceutical industry. And so once they've grown to a large enough density in the bioreactor, we then harvest that product and make the tasty meat products you know and love today.
And what are the environmental benefits of producing chicken meat or any other meat through cell culture instead of traditional farming methods?
The environmental benefits for cultivated meat are many, but they come down to we're using fewer resources. You have a much cleaner water supply going in and out of the supply chain. Lower greenhouse gas emissions. We're also using less land. So, for example, to grow 1 calorie of beef, it takes 34 calories of input. And that goes primarily from the amount of food that is required to grow the cow, because animals are really inefficient converters of feed into meat, where what we're doing is we're taking just the cell and growing more of the cells directly from the raw material inputs, because we're not growing tissue, brain, all of the other things, or the other things required to produce meat from an animal. We're just growing the meat part. So for cultivated meat, we're talking about potentially using about 90% fewer greenhouse gas impacts by just using renewable energy in our production process. And we're also talking about a switch from cultivated meat by 2030 could actually reduce animal farming land use by about 77% by some estimates. So there's a really large efficiency gain to be had to make it really dry and a cleaner process.
They are very impactful in terms of the numbers. Is there a particular reason that your team has chosen the route to first focus on chicken meat? Is it, for example, a simpler cell culture, or what was the motivation for that?
There's a variety of reasons. You know, Americans love chicken, and we're in the US, and so that's, I think, a big market driver for us. But at the end of the day, Upside wants to produce all of the species that you would normally find in a grocery store. So we're certainly not limiting ourselves to one product, but chicken is definitely a familiar and safe option for us to start with.
Understandably. While doing background research for this interview, I read that according to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, chicken livestock has expanded to the point that there are now approximately 3 chickens for every human on the planet. And it seems like a pretty unfathomable number of livestock animals. Are there any health benefits or drawbacks of consuming cultured chicken compared to traditionally farmed chicken?
Our products have a similar nutrient composition to conventional chicken that, you or I would eat every day. The interesting part is we also have a significantly lower risk of zoonotic diseases because we don't need to pack thousands of animals into one place. And so the risk of new transmissible diseases is significantly lower. The other part is we're not using antibiotics anywhere in the process. So on top of zoonotic disease risk is also the risk of antibiotic-resistant diseases when you are looking at places like confined animal feed operations, because those places often use significant quantities of antibiotics to control disease outbreaks in the population of animals that they're growing. So for cultivated meat, we don't have any of the risks associated with that particular problem. We also avoid things like fecal contamination, where you'd get salmonella or other types of pathogenic foodborne illnesses introduced into the meat supply. So we're avoiding a lot of the human health risks associated with foodborne illnesses.
Definitely a major upside, pun intended there. But according to a Wired article discussing an FDA 2020 report, over 6 million kilos of antibiotics are fed to farm animals in the US annually. So it is a major amount. And this is thought to be related to antibiotic-resistant bacteria affecting humans. And you mentioned that cell culture meat is it completely free of antibiotics, or how would you describe that?
We don't use any antibiotics in the production process. In fact, for the type of cell culture that we do, it's actually a counterproductive tool. So for a variety of reasons, the antibiotic, if you use it in a culture system, it doesn't always kill all of the microorganisms that could get into your system. So antibiotic use can actually hide latent infections in the culture. And if you have that, then you've wasted a bunch of resources and time on a culture that you have to bring down and throw away. So that's an operationally expensive risk. The other thing is antibiotics themselves are expensive. And for food products, we are in a very, very tight profit margin market. And so you don't want to have anything in the production system that's expensive and unnecessary. So it's really better not to have bacteria in the system at all. So the production process for us is completely sterile. And the cool part is the biopharmaceutical industry has been using antibiotic-free manufacturing processes for the last 20 plus years. And so there's long precedent for doing antibiotic-free large-scale bioprocess manufacturing because they have very stringent sterility procedures to ensure that the cultures that you're maintaining inside your bioreactors stay sterile.
This also takes us nicely into the medium of nutrients required for the growth of these cells. You gave us a good overview of the cell culturing process, but what about more specifically, can you describe the medium or nutrients required for the growth of these cells?
Sure. So we are designing a media system that is based on the concept of reduce, reuse, recycle, because the media is the bulk of the cost of cultivated meat because it's the major raw material input. And so the media itself is made up of amino acids, those are proteins, fats, sugars, salts, water. And we want to design a system that converts as much of those raw materials into cells as possible in order to make it efficient and cost effective. So again, reduce, reduce, recycle is our strategy.
And how do you then ensure the texture and taste of cultured chicken so that they are similar or even better than traditionally farmed chicken in terms of taste?
taste, texture, and aroma are obviously super important because that's the end product that people put in their mouths. They have the experience and they're excited about it. So for us, in order to achieve the meat experience you're looking for, we think of taste, texture, and aroma as compositional characteristics of the product. And those compositional characteristics are things that we can trace back to a molecular level. So we have very sophisticated analytical tools that probe the different micronutrient or macronutrient characteristics that give a product its flavor. So for example, certain amino acid profiles correlate directly to a certain taste and flavor profile. So we have lots of analytical tools, and then at the end of the process, we check it against the best analytical tool known to humans, which is right here. It's your human sensory perception system. And since I've started working there at Upside, it's been really neat to watch the data come out of how things change over time and then look at it against the human sensory perception systems that we have.
Have you then tasted the food products yourself already?
I have. I started 7.5+ years ago, something like that. And I've tasted many of the iterations of our different product portfolio options. And it has been really interesting to experience how things change over time as you pull different levers in the system or in the media composition to see how they change.
Sounds exciting. And what type of cells are then primarily used for culturing chicken meat, and why are these cells preferred?
So we are looking for a variety of cells. You may have heard in the news that we use things like primary cells and stem cells. That's true. At a high level, we are focused on taking cells from different parts of an animal that people typically eat. So, chicken breast, thigh, those kinds of areas. And we're really focused on the cell type lineages that make up muscle. So connective tissue, fat, muscle, fibers. Those are all things that are from the mesoderm lineage for all of the cell biology nerds out there. And so our products are ultimately can be one or a combination of any of these cell types. And what we're looking for are cells with the best performance in our system across all of the different cell types. So what we're talking about with performance is those cells need to be viable in the commercial manufacturing process. So their metabolic signatures have a certain profile that we're looking for. Their ability to maintain their performance during and stable in a production process, because what you want is a stable, consistent process. You do not want the cells suddenly changing over time, because that would be inconsistent. You wouldn't know how to control that. And then finally, the cells have to taste good and give a great sensory experience. So those are all the characteristics of things that we're looking for in the cells.
Understandably. And how much cell material does Upside Foods need for the cell bank used to create consumption-ready chicken meat? What type of volumes are we talking about?
So the start of the production process is that little 1 milliliter vial I was talking about earlier from the cell bank. And so that 1 milliliter vial has a couple million cells in it. And those couple million cells divide and divide and divide and divide, and then they can make thousands of pounds of meat at the end of the production process.
And what are the current research focuses in the field of cell-cultured meats? That's probably a broad question, but to name some.
Sure, yeah, it is a huge question. And the research focus areas are actually very broad, and it covers every sector of the industry, both directly and tangentially. So there's a lot of focus on the media and the cell feed development, the cell lines and cell biology of the cells themselves. The bioreactor development is also huge, depending on what type of formats you want to be working in, whether it's a suspension culture or something that grows tissue sheets. Those are things that are super important to the industry. And we're also seeing lots of innovation in the product formulation space. So the food research and development side of the equation is also very important, and Upside is actively exploring a lot of these areas, as are many companies around the world, as a singular focus for each of them.
And what would you say have been some of the biggest scientific challenges in the culturing process?
There are quite a few.
There must be so much left unsaid with the 7 years of research that...
Yes. So we at Upside and in the field in general, we are what we need to do is make a delicious meat product at low cost, very high yield. It's got to taste great. It nutritionally has to be equivalent to meat. It also needs to be safe, and it needs to achieve our environmental and animal welfare and human health objectives. And that all has to happen at the same time. So all of those activities that I just mentioned, some of them can be inversely correlated. So when you have a success in one, you may have dropped the efficiency of the other thing. So for example, you may have a very high yielding, great process, but it's in an incredibly expensive media that you wouldn't actually be able to turn into a profitable product. So in your activities to lower the cost of the media, you may have then introduced a sensory impact. And so there's a whole lot of going back and forth to optimize the system in a sensible but iterative fashion. And all of that work is underpinned by a lot of foundational science. And we're talking about, thinking through mechanistic understanding of cellular metabolism at like a super detailed level, all the way to the science of omics, where we're studying like proteomics and genomics and the big high level, like genome wide things that we're understanding about cell biology, all the way to the specifics of the metabolism that actually influence sensory at a cellular level. So there's, depending on which part of the equation you want to talk about, that goes really deep, really fast.
Understandably. It also begs the question, would you say that now, 7 years later, your team's understanding of these challenges and the best practices related to solve them has vastly improved? It definitely sounds like there's been so much iteration on the research and the production.
Yeah, I think to take an aside, Upside's a startup, and so we are building the rocket ship as we're flying it. It is a common used analogy, and I think we're finally at a place where we've put the foundational systems in place where we can really start going deep quickly and resolving a lot of the core questions that we've been wrestling with for the last several years, which is really exciting.
Awesome. Sounds really good. All the best with that. What about then the byproducts of the cell culturing products? Is there any significant waste generated during the production process?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the reduce, reuse, recycle model is our approach to the media design. And the media is the biggest input, and the processed media, the spent media, is the biggest output. So we are really in the business of making sure that the cells eat all of the things that we feed them. And so the output of the process is primarily wastewater. And we want to make sure that wastewater is as close to water as possible and not loaded with all of the nutrients that were supposed to go into the cells.
And how would you describe the progress with that? Would you say that you are able to very efficiently kind of end up with almost just water, or how would you describe the output?
I don't know the specifics of where we're at right now, but I know that we're on that path. I think theoretically we would love it to be water, but in practice, I don't know if the biology would actually support that. But there are definitely water treatment systems that one could put onto an industrial scale facility to do that kind of treatment. So it's certainly possible, but it would have to be investigated to see if it was a cost-effective strategy to do that.
Understandably. What about the technological advancements that have enabled the large-scale production of lab-grown chicken? Maybe discussing the bioreactor or any other tech advancement that you've seen during your 7 years at the company?
I'll take it back a little further than my 7 years. So in order for cultivated meat to even be something that would be feasible for us today, we are standing on the shoulders of the biopharma industry and regenerative medicine, because they worked out a lot of the large-scale bioprocess that is required for suspension cultures to work. And that happened over the last 30 years in order to make life-saving drugs and pharmaceuticals. So they also helped work out things like how you actually do the manufacturing process controls to ensure that you have a consistent, safe, and quality product. So we're standing on all of those tech advancements. So if you think about what we're doing, it's an extension of that, but some of the fundamental leaps are going to be around the integral tissue space, where you're growing not just floating cells, but big pieces of tissue.
In November 2022, the FDA completed its first pre-market consultation for human food made using animal cell culture tech. Could you explain this process and what it means for Upside Foods and animal cell culture tech in the US?
I'll give you a little bit of history about how that regulatory framework came to be. So in the previous administration, Upside got in contact with the United States government and worked with them to propose a joint regulatory framework between USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, and FDA, which is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And the reason for that was we knew that they both had expertise in areas that were relevant to what we were doing. And so we wanted to slot into existing norms around what was possible. So both agencies agreed to co-regulate this space, and the FDA will oversee all the cell collection, development of the bioprocess, the cell banks, and the scale up for the cell growth, while the USDA oversees traditionally meat processing and food products. And so for us, that means they're overseeing the suitability of ingredients, the processing, labeling of cultivated meat and poultry products. So that's the backstory. So what happened for Upside is we worked with FDA, and in November of the last year, we received a no questions letter, or this year, we received a no questions letter from FDA, which means that they accepted that Upside's conclusions of safety were acceptable to the agency. And so they had no further questions about the safety of our products. And that was a long process going back and forth with them. And then at the end of that process, we were able to start with the USDA. And in June 2023, we received the grant of inspection and a label approval from USDA. And the grant of inspection means that USDA came, inspected the facility, found it to be to their standards. And then the label approval is what it sounds like. It's similar to the label you'd see on the back of most food products. And so with those two steps complete, we were able to legally sell our product. And while that's great for Upside and very exciting, what is even better for the whole industry is that we've paved the way for everybody else who's coming behind us to have a framework by which to walk through the government and demonstrate the safety of their products as well. So it's exciting because it's a legitimizing moment for the whole industry and allows other companies the opportunity to also, have safe products on market.
Is Upside now selling the product on the US market already, or discuss the steps going forward?
So we launched our first product with Dominique Kren in San Francisco in the beginning of July of this year. And it was really exciting. Dominique's a fantastic chef partner. We're really excited to work with her. She's a 3 Michelin star chef. She stopped serving meat in her restaurant a couple years ago because she didn't like how it got to the table. And when she tasted our product, she was like, "You guys, I want to work with you." And so for us, that was extremely exciting because, first of all, we knew that our product tasted good. And then we had the validation of a 3-star chef to back that up. And then we got to launch it, which was also really exciting.
How would you describe the roadmap in terms of working with restaurants in the beginning? Is Upside also focusing in selling in supermarkets in the future? How can you describe that?
talking a little bit about the scale situation. So for upside and the cell-based meat space in general to be successful, we need to be at very low cost and very high production scale. So for where companies are right now, it's a matter of like what scale we can support. So for upside right now, what we can support is a low volume, high price point product. And as we build our new commercial manufacturing facility, we're going to go down that cost curve, and then we'll have the ability to scale up and wider. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We certainly, as an industry, will not succeed if we are only selling to the high price point end of the market. We need to make sure this is available as an option for the rest of the price tiers available on socioeconomic backgrounds of humans who want to eat meat.
Definitely makes sense, and also a tried and tested go-to-market strategy with starting from premium and then optimizing on cost. So makes sense. What about Upside's investors, who include some very notorious investors such as Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Jack Welch, and Kimball Musk? What do you think this implies about the company's value proposition?
I think it implies in general that we're very solutions-oriented. The individuals you mentioned, they're impact investors. They're known for looking into the future and making bets on things that will change the world. And we are super excited about that perspective because that's fundamentally at this time in history what cultivated meat is. We also welcome our big conventional agricultural giant investors like Cargill and Tyson. So they know that business as usual conventional animal meat production is going to have to change in order to feed the 9 billion people who are coming by 2050. So one of our values is Big Tent, where we firmly believe that it's important to use common ground to solve these big issues, because the only way to move forward is really by working together and leveraging each other's strengths to move forward.
As you mentioned, you're kind of focusing on the premium route as your first go-to-market, then optimizing on the costs. Currently, cultured meat is understandably more expensive still than farm chicken meat, but the price is already trending down. How do you see the price evolving in the near future in terms of consumer prices, for example?
We need to have this available to consumers at every socioeconomic level, as I mentioned. And from the day that I started over 7 years ago, we've actually come down more than 1,000 times in reducing the cost. And we're now starting to touch process economics that will work for large-scale distribution. So what's cool is we're realizing what we were saying from the early days, where we can get down the cost curve. And now what we need to do is scale it up and set up the supply chains that allow us to actually touch and realize those price points. So we need to hit cost parity with conventional meat. It's hard to predict exactly when that will happen, but we're hoping 5 to 10 years for it to be widely available. But that's dependent on a lot of different factors. This space is certainly not like other tech industries where you can throw money at a problem. We still have to build large manufacturing facilities. Those facilities take, in some cases, a couple of years to come online and be fully operational and fully at capacity for their output. So there's a lot to do between now and when we can actually start, playing in the supermarket shelves right next to conventional products at the same price point.
Understandably. Your company's founder and CEO, Dr. Uma Valeti, has stated that the recent FDA no questions letter that you already mentioned marks a major step towards a new era in meat production. And as you already mentioned, not only are you kind of finding your way to the market in the US, but also paving the way for other players in the future. Can you also please elaborate on the potential effects this will have in the future for meat production in general?
I think this is a really groundbreaking moment for Upside and the industry as a whole and around the world. So getting full regulatory approval in the US was a milestone we've been working towards since we started in 2015. And it obviously revolutionizes meat production to be more humane, sustainable, and resilient food system. But it also allows other countries who may have less of an established regulatory infrastructure to copy what the US did. So it allows access to the systems that we set up to propagate around the world for people that want to use it and have cultivated meat, but may not have the government infrastructure in order to regulate it in their own countries. So it's nice because it provides a framework for others to copy.
Understandably, and eager to also see how this is worked out in EU regulation in Europe. What do you see as the biggest risk for cultured animal cell tech?
Like any new industry, it really comes back to scaling up production in a cost-effective manner. We need to make the safe products at the right price. They have to taste great and make a lot of product. So achieving scale quickly enough to have a positive environmental impact, there's definitely, from where I'm sitting, a pressure to get this right before the next major climate catastrophe, which seems to be almost every other day now. And those, I think, are the really big ones. We're also at risk of converting the supply chain that goes into conventional animal agriculture into cultivated meat. And what I mean by that risk is there is a resource limitation constraint around those two things. But the great news is we're working on this with our investors like Cargill and Tyson, who really deeply understand this space so that we can work through it.
Understandably, and not a trivial task to solve, right? So all the best with that. How do you envision the future of food? If you can kind of just take a step back from your day-to-day work at the company, how do you see humankind eating in 10, 20, or 40 years?
I think there's a lot of new strategies on how to expand the food supply. And the world fundamentally has to embrace new ways of producing food. So I think there's a lot of interesting things around vertical farming and different types of regenerative agriculture that will support future generations. And fundamentally, the only way for us to do this is in an environmentally sound and sustainable manner. So excited to see what's going to come out of that.
Exactly. Going back to the bioreactors then, where the actual cell growth happens, right? They don't produce ready-to-eat cuts of meat, as you mentioned. The harvested cells need to be refined and shaped, but could you kind of just discuss what phases are included or mandatory here in terms of production?
Sure. So there are really two ways in terms of the bioprocess to make the meat products that, we're familiar with. The first is to use a strategy that forms tissue, and that actually does come out of the bioreactor ready to eat after a short processing step. So our cultivated chickens don't actually have to walk around a barnyard, but we basically are growing the tissue itself, and you can eat that directly out of the bioreactor effectively after a little bit of tuning. The second strategy is to make a slurry. So that's the suspension product where you are growing cells in suspension, you pull down the slurry, and then you mix those cells with plant proteins to give it texture. There's a lot of companies doing this. And then they may use something like extrusion, or they may use 3D printing. So if you think of those two things, and I use the analogy of a hot dog, which is a loose analogy. So a hot dog is fundamentally digested meat that is reconstituted and put back together. For the suspension process, we're thinking about just stopping the process before it becomes the tissue and just the cells, if that makes sense. And for upside, we want to make sure that we're exploring all of the product formats. So we are investigating both of these strategies in order to make our products.
And how would you address concerns from traditional farmers who see cell-cultured meat as a threat to their livelihood?
I think this is a really important question, and I'm glad you brought it up. Cultivated meat is an and solution, not an or solution. And here's what I mean by that. Humans need to find a balance between producing more food and sustaining the planet for future generations. So for me, the way I think about it is the threat from climate change puts not only our livelihoods, but all of our lives at risk. And in order to change how we do things, cultivated meat can be seen as one of those tools in the toolbox. In order to feed the 9 billion people who are coming, the largest agricultural giants know that we can't get there with business as usual strategies for what we're doing today. So we really want to allow people to keep their important cultural food heritages. And so this is just an and solution, not an or, to give people choice in like how they want to feed their families going forward.
While doing background research, one of the wildest pieces of information I found was that the Associated Press had stated that there is a rumor about human cells being used in the culturing process. Now, this seems pretty preposterous, but could you please comment or debunk this myth just for clarity?
Of course. So our products only contain animal cells. We test our cells and our process before, during, and after the production process to ensure that our products are what we say and think they are. So to dive a little bit deeper into what that means, we actually sequence the cells that go into the cell banks to verify that our chicken cells, our beef cells are beef cells, and whatever species we say is in that vial is in that vial. We also check that as it's coming out of the bioreactor to verify that we have maintained the right quality control checks. It's also required by the regulatory system that we set up that we do that testing. And it's normal for food companies to test their products. Our testing involves things like species checks, but we do lots of testings to make sure that they're the things we say they are. And it's very important that we win trust by consumers by being truthful in what we say. And one of those things is, very straightforward in putting the right species in the right product. It would be very easy for somebody to figure out if we had not done that. So that is just a rumor on the internet, and I will leave that rumor there.
Definitely. Well, what about kind of personally and professionally, what advice would you give to someone considering entering the cell-cultured meat industry?
I would say that there is only so much time in this life to do something impactful. So what are you waiting for? If you want to, try to help solve the world's most pressing issues and you have an interest in food, this is a really, really great field to get into. So do it.
Sounds like a good pitch for anybody interested. In your opinion, what time frame are we looking at before lab-grown meats becomes mainstream and widely accessible? You already touched upon this, but just as a final thought.
I don't have a crystal ball, unfortunately, but it really depends on what companies can get products into people's hands in a widely distributed fashion. So Upside is trying to aim for price parity with conventional meat in the next 5 to 15 years, and that would include also wider distribution. The uncertainty comes from we just don't know what the different hurdles are that we're going to run into and have to overcome over that time period. So that's the reason for the wide range of time estimates. So 5 to 10 to 15 years is really the horizon we're thinking.
Understandably, but it's not that far off then either way. Well, who would you like to know more about your work or your company's value proposition?
I would love guilty carnivores like myself to know about this. Like, I love meat, I love pork, but how it gets to the plate is definitely something that I have a lot of cognitive dissonance around and try to ignore. But at the end of the day, when you look in the mirror, those are the kind of people I would love to know about what we're doing.
And lastly, do you think humankind has the ingenuity to solve some of our biggest environmental and scientific challenges?
Yes, I think we do. If you look over the course of human history, we're a pretty darn resilient species. We're really creative, and we have shown that we can solve some of the biggest challenges that we decide to take on. And, I think we have to. The option B for what we're about to experience potentially with the planet is really not something anybody wants to. You don't want to go down that particular path. So I think with our minds together and strategies to solve this, we can do it. So let's do it.
Great. Thanks so much, Danielle, for being on the show. Really interesting to see where Upside Foods and your whole team is heading, and all the best with your work in the future as well.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, Danielle Desmet, for joining us today. And thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. The future is looking more sustainable and exciting than ever. I can't wait to see what's next on the menu. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the flavors of innovation. This is Joel, signing off from Future Here. See you in the next episode.
Future